The wind howled through the narrow streets of Maplewood like a living thing, carrying with it the sharp bite of December cold that seemed to seep through every layer of clothing, every crack in the window panes, every gap beneath the doors. It was the kind of cold that made your bones ache, the kind that turned your breath into thick clouds of white vapor that hung in the air for just a moment before being swept away by the relentless gusts. The sky had been gray for 3 days now, a heavy blanket of clouds that pressed down on the small town with an almost physical weight, and everyone who lived there knew what was coming. They could feel it in the air, taste it on their tongues, sense it in the way the birds had gone silent and the squirrels had disappeared into their hidden nests. A storm was coming, and not just any storm, but the kind of snowstorm that people would talk about for years to come, the kind that would be measured not in inches but in feet, the kind that would transform the familiar landscape into something strange and beautiful and dangerous all at once. Margaret Chin stood at her kitchen window on the 3rd floor of the old brick apartment building on Elm Street, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long since gone cold. She was 73 years old, though she often forgot this fact until she caught sight of her reflection in a mirror or tried to bend down to pick something up off the floor and felt the protest in her knees and back. Her apartment was small but tidy, filled with the accumulated treasures of a long life, photographs in mismatched frames, books stacked on every available surface, a collection of ceramic birds that her late husband had given her over the course of their 42 years together, one for each anniversary and birthday and Christmas. The radiator hissed and clanked in the corner, doing its best to fight off the cold that pressed against the windows, and the smell of the tea, chamomile with a hint of honey, mingled with the faint scent of the cinnamon candles she had lit earlier that morning. She had been watching the street below for the better part of an hour, watching as people hurried past with their heads down and their shoulders hunched against the wind, watching as the few remaining leaves on the old oak tree across the street were torn free and sent tumbling through the air like tiny brown dancers. She had lived in this apartment for 35 years, had raised her 2 children here, had said goodbye to her husband here, had watched the neighborhood change and evolve and sometimes struggle. She knew every crack in the sidewalk, every storefront, every face that passed by her window. But lately, she had begun to feel like a ghost in her own life, invisible and insubstantial, watching the world go by without really being part of it. Her children lived far away now, Daniel in California and Susan in Texas, both with families and careers and lives that seemed impossibly busy and complicated. They called every Sunday, dutiful and loving, but the conversations always felt rushed, punctuated by the sounds of grandchildren shouting in the background or the ping of incoming emails that demanded attention. They had invited her to spend Christmas with them, of course, taking turns each year, but the thought of the long flight, the disruption to her routine, the effort of packing and unpacking and being a guest in someone else's home, even the home of her own children, felt overwhelming. So she had told them she was fine, that she had plans with friends, that she preferred to stay in her own space. It was only a small lie, the kind that people tell to spare their loved ones from worry. The truth was that Margaret had no plans for Christmas. The friends she had made over the decades had slowly drifted away, claimed by death or illness or moves to warmer climates or retirement communities. The building itself had changed, the familiar faces replaced by young professionals who came and went like the seasons, barely nodding in the hallway, always staring at their phones, always in a hurry. She sometimes felt like she was the last remnant of a different era, a time when people knew their neighbors, when doors were left unlocked, when children played in the streets until the streetlights came on. A gust of wind rattled the window, and Margaret jumped slightly, the cold tea sloshing in her mug. She sat it down on the counter and pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. The weather forecast had been dire, warning of a massive storm system moving in from the north, bringing with it winds of up to 60 miles per hour and snowfall that could reach 3 feet or more. The mayor had declared a state of emergency, urging everyone to stock up on supplies and stay indoors. Margaret had made a trip to the grocery store the day before, shuffling through the crowded aisles with her small cart, picking up bread and milk and canned soup, the essentials that everyone seemed to be hoarding as if preparing for the end of the world. She turned away from the window and surveyed her small domain. The apartment felt too quiet, too empty, the silence broken only by the hiss of the radiator and the occasional creak of the old building settling. The Christmas decorations she had put up seemed almost mocking in their cheerfulness, the small artificial tree with its blinking lights, the garland draped over the doorway, the nativity scene on the bookshelf. She had put them up out of habit, out of a sense of obligation to the season, but they brought her no joy, only a deep ache of loneliness that she tried very hard not to acknowledge. 3 floors below, in apartment 1A, Marcus Williams was pacing back and forth across his living room, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice tight with frustration. He was 32 years old, tall and lean, with close-cropped hair and the kind of restless energy that made it difficult for him to sit still for more than a few minutes at a time. He had moved to Maplewood 6 months ago, taking a job as a software engineer at a startup downtown, and he still felt like an outsider, still hadn't quite figured out how to make this place feel like home. "Mom, I know," he said, running his free hand over his face in a gesture of exhaustion. "I wanted to be there, I really did, but the storm is supposed to hit in a few hours and all the flights are being canceled. There is nothing I can do about it. I am stuck here." His mother's voice on the other end of the line was a mixture of disappointment and concern, and Marcus felt the familiar weight of guilt settling on his shoulders. This would have been his first Christmas back home in Detroit since taking the job, his first chance to see his family, to sleep in his old room, to eat his mother's cooking, to play with his nieces and nephews. He had been looking forward to it for weeks, had bought presents and wrapped them carefully, had arranged for time off work. And now, because of the weather, because of circumstances beyond his control, he was going to spend Christmas alone in a city where he barely knew anyone. "I will be fine," he said, trying to inject some confidence into his voice. "I have plenty of food, the heat works, I will just hunker down and wait it out. You guys have a great Christmas, okay? Give everyone my love." He ended the call and tossed the phone onto the couch, then walked to the window and looked out at the darkening sky. The wind was picking up, sending trash cans rolling down the street, bending the bare branches of the trees until they looked like they might snap. He could see a few snowflakes beginning to fall, small and tentative at first, but he knew it was just the beginning. The apartment felt cold despite the heat, sterile and impersonal, with its white walls and generic furniture that had come with the place. He had not bothered to decorate for Christmas, had not seen the point when he was supposed to be gone. Now the lack of any festive cheer made the space feel even more depressing. Marcus walked to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator, staring at the meager contents, a carton of eggs, some leftover Chinese takeout, a 6-pack of beer, condiments. He had not thought to stock up on supplies because he had not planned to be here. He grabbed a beer and twisted off the cap, taking a long drink and trying to push down the feeling of self-pity that threatened to overwhelm him. He was an adult, he told himself. He could handle being alone for a few days. It was not the end of the world. On the second floor, in apartment 2C, Elena Rodriguez was trying to get her 5-year-old daughter, Sophia, to eat dinner, a task that seemed to grow more difficult with each passing day. Sophia sat at the small kitchen table, her dark curls pulled back in a ponytail, her lower lip pushed out in a pout, her arms crossed over her chest in a posture of absolute defiance. "I do not want soup," Sophia announced for the third time. "I want pizza." Elena took a deep breath, counting to 10 in her head, reminding herself that patience was a virtue, that her daughter was only 5, that this was just a phase. She was 28 years old, a single mother working 2 jobs to make ends meet, and she was tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion, tired in her bones, in her soul. She worked as a waitress at a diner during the day and cleaned offices at night, and every moment in between was devoted to Sophia, to making sure her daughter had everything she needed, even if Elena herself had to go without. "Mija, we do not have pizza," Elena said, her voice gentle but firm. "And we cannot go out to get pizza because of the storm. The soup is warm and it will make you feel good. Please, just try a little bit." Sophia's eyes filled with tears, and Elena felt her heart clench. She knew her daughter was picking up on her stress, on the worry that Elena tried so hard to hide. Money was tight, tighter than usual, and Christmas was only 3 days away. She had managed to buy Sophia a few small presents, a coloring book and some crayons, a stuffed animal, but it was nothing compared to what other children would be getting, nothing compared to what Elena wished she could provide. The wind howled outside, and the lights flickered for a moment, causing both Elena and Sophia to look up in alarm. Elena walked to the window and peered out, seeing the snow beginning to fall in earnest now, thick white flakes that swirled and danced in the wind. She had heard the weather reports, knew that this was going to be bad, but she had not really allowed herself to think about what it might mean. She had to work tomorrow, had to make the money to pay the rent that was due in a week. But looking at the storm gathering strength outside, she realized that might not be possible. She turned back to Sophia, who had finally picked up her spoon and was taking small, reluctant bites of soup. Elena sat down across from her and reached out to smooth a stray curl away from her daughter's face. Sophia looked up at her with those big brown eyes, so trusting, so full of love, and Elena felt a surge of fierce protectiveness. Whatever happened, she would keep her daughter safe and warm. That was all that mattered. In apartment 2B, right next door to Elena and Sophia, James and Patricia Kowalski were having an argument, their voices rising and falling in a familiar rhythm that had become the soundtrack of their marriage over the past year. They were both in their mid-40s, had been married for 22 years, had raised 3 children who were now grown and gone, and somewhere along the way, they had lost each other. The apartment that had once felt cozy and full of life now felt like a cage, and they circled each other like wary animals, each waiting for the other to make a wrong move. "I am just saying that maybe we should have gone to visit Michael for Christmas," Patricia said, her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to hold something in. "Instead of staying here in this miserable place." James stood by the window, his back to her, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and thick around the middle, with graying hair and a face that had once been handsome but now just looked tired. "And I am just saying that Michael did not actually invite us," he said, his voice flat. "He said they were going to his in-laws. We would have been intruding." Patricia made a sound of frustration, somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "So we are just going to sit here and pretend everything is fine? Pretend that we are not completely miserable?" James turned to look at her, and for a moment, something flickered in his eyes, something that might have been pain or regret or longing. But then it was gone, replaced by the same weary resignation that had become his default expression. "I do not know what you want me to say, Patricia. I do not know how to fix this." The lights flickered again, more pronounced this time, and they both fell silent, listening to the wind that seemed to be trying to tear the building apart. Patricia walked to the window and stood beside James, not touching him, but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. They watched the snow falling, watched as the street below began to disappear under a blanket of white. "It is really coming down," James said quietly. "Yes," Patricia replied, and for a moment they stood there together in silence, united by nothing more than their shared observation of the storm. The snow fell harder and faster as the evening wore on, transforming Maplewood into a winter wonderland that would have been beautiful if it were not so dangerous. The wind howled and shrieked, driving the snow into drifts that piled up against doors and cars and buildings. The temperature dropped steadily, falling from the low 20s into the teens and then into the single digits. The streets emptied as people retreated into their homes, battening down the hatches, preparing to wait out the storm. By 8 o'clock that evening, the power went out. It happened suddenly, without warning, the lights simply blinking out and plunging the building into darkness. Margaret was sitting in her armchair, reading by the light of her lamp, when everything went black. She sat very still for a moment, her heart pounding, waiting for the lights to come back on. But they did not. The silence was profound, broken only by the howling of the wind outside. Even the radiator had gone quiet, and Margaret realized with a sinking feeling that without power, there would be no heat. She fumbled in the darkness, her hands shaking slightly, until she found the flashlight she kept in the drawer of the side table. The beam of light was thin and weak, but it was better than nothing. She stood up slowly, her joints protesting, and made her way to the kitchen, where she kept candles in one of the drawers. She lit 3 of them and placed them around the living room, their flickering light casting dancing shadows on the walls. The apartment already felt colder, and Margaret pulled a blanket from the back of the couch and wrapped it around her shoulders. She tried not to panic, tried to tell herself that the power would come back on soon, that this was just a temporary inconvenience. But deep down, she knew better. A storm like this could knock out power for days, and she was alone, with no way to stay warm, no way to cook, no way to call for help if something went wrong. Her cell phone was in the bedroom, but she rarely used it and was not even sure if it was charged. The landline was dead without power. For the first time in a long time, Margaret felt truly afraid. 3 floors below, Marcus was also fumbling in the darkness, cursing under his breath as he tried to find his phone. He had been watching a movie on his laptop when the power went out, and now he was blind, stumbling over furniture, his hands outstretched in front of him. He finally found his phone on the coffee table, the screen lighting up and providing a small circle of illumination. He turned on the flashlight function and looked around the apartment, taking stock of his situation. No power meant no heat, no internet, no way to charge his devices once the batteries died. He had a few candles somewhere, left over from a romantic dinner that had not gone well, and he dug them out of a kitchen drawer and lit them. The apartment looked eerie in the candlelight, the shadows deep and menacing. He checked his phone and saw that he still had service, at least for now, and he quickly sent a text to his mother letting her know what was happening. He walked to the window and looked out, but there was nothing to see except darkness and swirling snow. The street lights were out, the buildings were dark, the whole city seemed to have been swallowed by the storm. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature, a sense of isolation that was almost physical. He was alone in the dark, in a place that did not feel like home, with no one to turn to and no idea how long this would last. On the second floor, Elena was trying to keep Sophia calm. Her daughter had started crying when the lights went out, frightened by the sudden darkness, and Elena had scooped her up and held her close, murmuring soothing words, stroking her hair. She had found a flashlight and some candles, and she had made a game of it, telling Sophia they were going on a camping adventure, that they were going to be brave explorers together. But inside, Elena was terrified. The apartment was already getting cold, and Sophia was wearing only thin pajamas. Elena piled every blanket she owned onto the couch and bundled Sophia up, then sat beside her, holding her close, trying to share her body heat. She had no idea how long the power would be out, no idea how they would stay warm if it lasted more than a few hours. She thought about knocking on her neighbors' doors, asking for help, but she barely knew anyone in the building, and the thought of admitting her vulnerability, of asking for charity, made her stomach twist with shame. Sophia had finally stopped crying and was now quiet, her thumb in her mouth, her eyes wide and scared. Elena kissed the top of her head and whispered, "It is going to be okay, Mija. Mama is here. Everything is going to be okay." But she was not sure she believed it. Next door, James and Patricia were sitting in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. James had found a camping lantern in the hall closet, left over from a trip they had taken years ago when the kids were still young, and its bright LED light filled the living room with a harsh white glow. Patricia had wrapped herself in a quilt and was sitting on the couch, staring at nothing. James stood by the window, watching the storm, his mind churning. "We should check on the neighbors," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. Patricia looked up at him, surprised. "What?" "The neighbors," James repeated, turning to face her. "The power is out, it is freezing, and we do not know how long this is going to last. We should check on people, make sure everyone is okay." Patricia stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to figure out if he was serious. "We do not even know our neighbors," she said finally. "Exactly," James said. "And that is a problem. We have been living here for 3 years, and we do not know a single person in this building. That is not right." Patricia felt something shift inside her, something she could not quite name. She looked at her husband, really looked at him, and saw something in his face that she had not seen in a long time: purpose, determination, a spark of the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. "Maybe you are right," she said softly. James nodded and grabbed the lantern. "Come on," he said. "Let us start with this floor and work our way up." They stepped out into the hallway, and the cold hit them immediately. Without power, the building's heating system was dead, and the temperature was dropping fast. James knocked on the door of apartment 2A, but there was no answer. The tenant there was a young man who traveled a lot for work, and he was probably out of town. They moved on to apartment 2C, and James knocked firmly. Inside, Elena heard the knock and froze. Sophia looked up at her with frightened eyes. "Who is it, Mama?" Elena did not know. She crept to the door and called out, "Who is there?" "It is James Kowalski from next door," came the reply. "We are checking on everyone because of the power outage. Are you okay?" Elena hesitated for a moment, then unlocked the door and opened it a crack. James and Patricia stood in the hallway, the lantern casting strange shadows on their faces. They looked concerned, genuine, and Elena felt some of her fear ease. "We are okay," Elena said, though her voice betrayed her uncertainty. "Just a little cold." Patricia peered past her and saw Sophia huddled on the couch, wrapped in blankets, her small face pale in the candlelight. "Oh, you have a little one," Patricia said, her voice softening. "Listen, it is going to get really cold tonight. Do you have enough blankets? Do you need anything?" Elena felt tears prick at her eyes, overwhelmed by the simple kindness of the question. "I think we will be okay," she said, but her voice wavered. James and Patricia exchanged a glance. "Look," James said, "if it gets too cold, you come knock on our door, okay? We can all huddle together, share body heat. No one should be alone in this." Elena nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "Thank you," she managed finally. They moved on, climbing the stairs to the third floor. The stairwell was pitch black, and they moved slowly, carefully, the lantern light bouncing off the walls. They knocked on apartment 3A, but again, no answer. Apartment 3B was occupied by a young couple who assured them they were fine, that they had a gas stove and plenty of blankets. And then they came to apartment 3C, Margaret's apartment. James knocked, and for a long moment, there was no response. He knocked again, louder this time. "Hello? Is anyone home? We are checking on everyone because of the storm." Inside, Margaret heard the knocking and felt a surge of relief so intense it almost brought her to tears. She had been sitting in the dark, wrapped in her blanket, feeling the cold seep into her bones, feeling more alone than she had ever felt in her life. She stood up, moving slowly, and made her way to the door. She opened it and found herself looking at two people she had seen in passing but never really spoken to, a middle-aged couple with kind faces and concerned eyes. "Are you all right?" Patricia asked gently. Margaret tried to speak, but her voice came out as a croak. She cleared her throat and tried again. "I am fine," she said, but even she could hear how unconvincing it sounded. James held up the lantern and looked past her into the apartment. He could see the candles burning, could see how small and frail she looked, could see the way she was shivering despite the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "Ma'am," he said, "it is going to get very cold tonight. Do you have family you can call? Someone who can come get you?" Margaret shook her head. "My children live far away," she said. "I will be fine. I have blankets." Patricia reached out and gently touched Margaret's arm. "What is your name?" "Margaret," she replied. "Margaret Chen." "Margaret, I am Patricia, and this is my husband James. We live on the second floor. And I do not think you should be alone up here tonight. It is not safe. Why do not you come down to our apartment? We can keep each other warm, wait out the storm together." Margaret felt something break inside her, some wall she had built up over the years to protect herself from disappointment and hurt. She looked at these two strangers who were offering her kindness for no reason other than basic human decency, and she felt tears spill down her cheeks. "I do not want to be a burden," she whispered. "You are not a burden," James said firmly. "You are our neighbor. Come on, let us get you downstairs where it is warmer." Margaret nodded, unable to speak. She gathered a few things, her warmest sweater, an extra blanket, her purse, and followed James and Patricia down the dark stairwell to the second floor. When they entered the Kowalski's apartment, the warmth from the camping lantern and the residual heat in the space felt like a blessing. Patricia settled Margaret on the couch and wrapped her in blankets, then went to make tea on the gas stove. James stood in the middle of the living room, looking at Margaret and then at the door. "There are more people in this building," he said. "We should bring them all together. It is safer that way, and warmer." Patricia looked at him and smiled, a real smile, the first genuine smile she had given him in months. "You are right," she said. "Let us do it." They went back out into the hallway and knocked on Elena's door again. When she opened it, James said, we are gathering everyone together in our apartment. It will be warmer if we all stay in one place. Will you and your daughter join us?" Elena looked at Sophia, who was watching with wide eyes, and then back at James and Patricia. She nodded. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." "Yes." They helped Elena gather some blankets and pillows, and Sophia clutched her stuffed animal as they made their way next door. When they entered the Kowalskis' apartment, Sophia's eyes went wide at the sight of Margaret sitting on the couch. The old woman smiled at her, and Sophia smiled back shyly. James and Patricia continued their rounds, going down to the first floor. They knocked on Marcus's door, and when he opened it, looking surprised and wary, James explained what they were doing. Marcus hesitated for only a moment before agreeing. He grabbed his phone charger and a blanket and followed them upstairs. By 9 o'clock, the Kowalskis' living room had been transformed into a makeshift shelter. Margaret sat on the couch, wrapped in blankets, sipping hot tea that Patricia had made. Elena and Sophia were curled up in an armchair, Sophia finally looking less frightened, her eyes drooping with exhaustion. Marcus sat on the floor, his back against the wall, looking around at the group with an expression that was equal parts bewilderment and relief. James and Patricia moved around the space, making sure everyone was comfortable, distributing blankets, lighting more candles. The apartment was warmer with all of them together, their combined body heat making a difference, and the atmosphere had shifted from fear and isolation to something else, something that felt almost like community. They were strangers, thrown together by circumstance, but in that moment, they were also something more. Patricia looked around at the assembled group and felt something shift in her chest, something warm and unexpected. "So," she said, "I guess we should introduce ourselves properly. I am Patricia Kowalski, and this is my husband James. We have lived in this building for 3 years, and I am ashamed to say we have not been very good neighbors." James nodded. "That is true," he said. "But we are going to change that, starting now." Margaret spoke up, her voice stronger now. "I am Margaret Chen. I have lived here for 35 years. I am a widow, and my children live far away. I am very grateful to you all for your kindness." Elena shifted in her chair, holding Sophia close. "I am Elena Rodriguez, and this is my daughter Sophia. We have been here for 2 years. I work 2 jobs, and I do not have much time for socializing, but I am glad to be here with all of you tonight." Marcus cleared his throat. "I am Marcus Williams. I moved here 6 months ago from Detroit. I work in tech, and I do not really know anyone in this city. I was supposed to fly home for Christmas, but the storm canceled my flight. So, yeah, here I am." Sophia, who had been quiet, suddenly piped up. "I am 5 years old," she announced, holding up 5 fingers. "And I like unicorns." Everyone laughed, and the sound was warm and genuine, breaking through the tension and fear that had been hanging over them. Margaret reached over and patted Sophia's hand. "I like unicorns too," she said with a smile. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the snow continued to fall, piling up in drifts that would take days to clear. But inside the apartment, something remarkable was happening. These 5 people, strangers just hours ago, were beginning to connect, to share their stories, to find common ground in their shared humanity. James rummaged through the kitchen cabinets and found some crackers and cheese, some canned soup, and a box of cookies. "It is not much," he said, "but we should eat something. Keep our strength up." They gathered around the coffee table, sharing the meager meal, and as they ate, they talked. Margaret told stories about the neighborhood, about how it used to be, about the families she had known and the changes she had witnessed. Elena talked about Sophia, about how hard it was to raise a child alone, about her dreams of going back to school someday, of building a better life. Marcus talked about his job, about how isolating it could be to work remotely, to spend all day staring at a screen, about how much he missed his family. James and Patricia talked about their children, about the empty nest syndrome that had hit them harder than they expected, about how they had lost sight of each other in the process of raising a family. As the night wore on, the temperature continued to drop, and they huddled closer together, sharing blankets, sharing warmth. Sophia fell asleep in Elena's arms, her breathing soft and even, and Margaret dozed off on the couch, her head tilted back, a peaceful expression on her face. Marcus, James, and Patricia stayed awake, talking in low voices, keeping watch, making sure the candles did not burn down too far, making sure everyone stayed warm. Around midnight, Marcus looked out the window and whistled softly. "You guys need to see this," he said. James and Patricia joined him at the window, and they all stared out at the transformed world. The snow had stopped falling, at least for the moment, and the clouds had parted just enough to let the moon shine through. The street below was buried under several feet of snow, the cars reduced to shapeless white mounds, the trees bent under the weight of ice and snow. Everything was silent and still, bathed in an ethereal silver light that made the world look like something out of a fairy tale. "It is beautiful," Patricia whispered. James put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, and for the first time in a long time, they felt like a team again, like partners facing the world together. Marcus watched them and felt a pang of longing, a desire for that kind of connection, that kind of partnership. He thought about his ex-girlfriend, about the relationship that had ended badly, about how he had thrown himself into work to avoid dealing with the loneliness. But being here, with these people, made him realize that maybe he did not have to be alone, that maybe connection was possible if he was willing to be vulnerable, to reach out, to take a chance. The night stretched on, and they took turns sleeping and keeping watch. The apartment grew colder, but they managed to stay warm enough by staying close together, by sharing their body heat and their blankets. When dawn finally came, gray and dim, the storm had started up again, the wind howling, the snow falling in thick sheets that obscured everything beyond a few feet. They woke slowly, stiff and sore from sleeping in awkward positions, but alive and safe. Patricia made more tea on the gas stove, and they shared the last of the crackers and cookies for breakfast. Sophia woke up and immediately asked if they could build a snowman, and everyone laughed at her enthusiasm, at her ability to find joy even in the midst of a crisis. "We cannot go outside yet, Mija," Elena said gently. "The storm is still going. But maybe later, when it stops, okay?" Sophia nodded, accepting this with the resilience of childhood. She climbed down from Elena's lap and walked over to Margaret, who was sitting on the couch, looking tired but content. "Can you tell me a story?" Sophia asked. Margaret smiled. "I would love to," she said. "Come sit with me." Sophia climbed up onto the couch and snuggled against Margaret's side, and the old woman wrapped an arm around her and began to tell a story about a little girl who lived in a magical forest where the trees could talk and the animals could sing. Her voice was soft and melodic, and everyone in the room found themselves listening, drawn in by the simple magic of storytelling. As Margaret spoke, Elena felt tears prick at her eyes. She had been so focused on survival, on making ends meet, on being strong for Sophia, that she had forgotten about the simple pleasures, the small moments of connection and joy. Watching her daughter with this kind old woman, seeing the way Sophia's face lit up with wonder, reminded her of what was truly important. Marcus pulled out his phone and checked the battery. It was down to 20%, and he had no way to charge it. He opened his messages and saw several from his mother, asking if he was okay, telling him they were thinking of him, sending him love. He typed out a quick reply, telling her he was safe, that he was with neighbors, that he would call when he could. Then he put the phone away and looked around at the group, at these people who had become something like family in the space of a single night. The storm raged on throughout the day, showing no signs of letting up. They passed the time by talking, by sharing stories, by playing simple games with Sophia. James found a deck of cards and taught Marcus how to play gin rummy. Patricia and Elena talked about cooking, swapping recipes, discovering a shared love of baking. Margaret continued to tell stories, her memory sharp and clear, her tale spanning decades of life in Maplewood. As the afternoon wore on, the temperature in the apartment continued to drop, and they could see their breath in the air. They piled on more blankets, huddled closer together, and tried to stay positive. But the reality of their situation was becoming harder to ignore. The power had been out for nearly 24 hours, and there was no telling when it would come back on. Their food supplies were dwindling, and the cold was becoming dangerous, especially for Margaret and Sophia. James stood by the window, looking out at the endless white, and felt a knot of worry in his stomach. "We need to think about what we are going to do if the power does not come back on soon," he said quietly to Patricia. Patricia nodded, her face serious. "I know. We cannot stay here indefinitely. But where would we go? The streets are impassable, and even if we could get out, where would we go?" James did not have an answer. He looked over at Margaret, who was dozing on the couch, her face pale and drawn, and he felt a surge of protectiveness. They had to keep her safe, had to keep all of them safe. But he did not know how. Marcus, who had been listening, spoke up. "My phone still has some battery left. Let me try calling 911, see if they can tell us anything about when the power might come back on or if there are any shelters open." He dialed the emergency number, but the call would not go through. The lines were jammed, overwhelmed by the sheer number of people trying to get help. He tried again and again, but each time, he got the same result, a busy signal or a recorded message telling him to try again later. "It is no use," he said, frustration evident in his voice. "The system is overloaded." Elena, who had been sitting quietly with Sophia, spoke up. "I have an idea," she said hesitantly. "It might sound crazy, but hear me out. What if we try to get to the church? St. Mary's, the one on Oak Street? It is only about 4 blocks from here. Churches usually have generators, and they often open as emergency shelters during storms. If we could get there, we might be able to get warm, get food, maybe even charge our phones." James considered this. 4 blocks did not sound like much, but in this weather, with the snow piled high and the wind still howling, it could be treacherous. But what other choice did they have? If they stayed here, they would freeze. At least if they tried to get to the church, they had a chance. "It is risky," he said. "But I think it might be our best option. We would need to bundle up as much as possible, stick together, move slowly and carefully. Margaret and Sophia would need extra help." Margaret, who had woken up and been listening, spoke up. "I can make it," she said, her voice firm despite her obvious exhaustion. "I am tougher than I look." Patricia smiled at her. "I do not doubt that for a second." "Okay, Let us do this. Let us gather everything we need and get ready to go. They spent the next hour preparing for the journey. They layered on every piece of warm clothing they could find, wrapping scarves around their faces, pulling on multiple pairs of socks, donning gloves and hats. They packed the remaining food and water into a backpack that Marcus volunteered to carry. James found some rope in a closet and suggested they tie themselves together, so no one would get separated in the storm. It seemed extreme, but everyone agreed it was a good idea. When they were finally ready, they stood in the hallway, looking at each other, a motley crew of bundled-up figures who looked more like Arctic explorers than city dwellers. James held the camping lantern, though its light would be almost useless in the storm. Patricia held Margaret's arm, ready to support her. Elena carried Sophia on her back, the little girl's arms wrapped tightly around her mother's neck. Marcus brought up the rear, making sure no one fell behind. They opened the building's front door, and the wind hit them like a physical force, nearly knocking them back. The cold was shocking, stealing the breath from their lungs, making their eyes water. The snow was waist-deep in places, and they had to wade through it, each step an effort, each breath a struggle. They moved slowly, painfully slowly, staying close together, the rope connecting them a lifeline in the whiteout conditions. The world had been reduced to a swirling chaos of white, the wind screaming in their ears, the cold seeping through every layer of clothing. James led the way, trying to navigate by memory, trying to remember the layout of the streets, but everything looked different, alien, transformed by the storm. Margaret stumbled, and Patricia caught her, holding her upright. "Are you okay?" Patricia shouted over the wind. Margaret nodded, though her face was pale and her breathing labored. "Keep going," she gasped. "I am fine." They pressed on, one agonizing step at a time. Sophia whimpered against Elena's back, and Elena murmured soothing words, though she was not sure her daughter could hear them over the roar of the storm. Marcus kept looking back, making sure everyone was still there, still moving, his own face numb with cold, his fingers and toes already losing feeling. Time seemed to stretch and distort. They could have been walking for minutes or hours, it was impossible to tell. The world had narrowed to the next step, the next breath, the need to keep moving, to not give up. James's lungs burned, his legs ached, but he forced himself to keep going, to be strong for the others. And then, through the swirling snow, he saw it, the dark shape of a building, the tall spire of the church rising up against the gray sky. Relief flooded through him, giving him a burst of energy. "There," he shouted, pointing. "The church. We made it." They stumbled forward, half walking, half crawling through the snow, until they reached the church steps. The front door was heavy and wooden, and James pounded on it with his fist, praying that someone was inside, that they had not made this journey for nothing. For a long, terrible moment, there was no response. And then the door swung open, and warm air rushed out, and a man in a priest's collar stood there, his eyes wide with surprise and concern. "Good Lord," he said. Come in quickly." They tumbled inside, a tangle of frozen limbs and snow-covered clothing, and the priest quickly shut the door behind them. The warmth of the church was almost painful after the brutal cold outside, and they stood there, shivering, trying to catch their breath, hardly able to believe they had made it. The priest, who introduced himself as Father Michael, quickly ushered them into the main hall of the church, where several other people were already gathered, refugees from the storm like themselves. There were cots set up, blankets piled high, and the smell of hot soup filled the air. A generator hummed in the background, providing power for lights and heat, and the space felt like a sanctuary, a haven from the chaos outside. Father Michael and several volunteers helped them out of their wet outer layers and wrapped them in dry blankets. They were given hot soup and bread, and they ate ravenously, the warmth spreading through their bodies, bringing them back to life. Sophia, who had been so brave during the journey, finally allowed herself to cry, and Elena held her close, rocking her gently, whispering that they were safe now, that everything was going to be okay. Margaret sat on one of the cots, wrapped in blankets, sipping soup, and felt tears streaming down her face. She was not sure if they were tears of relief or gratitude or simply the release of all the fear and loneliness she had been carrying. Patricia sat beside her and took her hand, squeezing it gently, and Margaret squeezed back, unable to speak but hoping her gratitude came through in that simple gesture. James and Marcus stood together, watching the scene, both of them feeling a profound sense of accomplishment and connection. They had done it. They had kept everyone safe. They had worked together, strangers becoming something more, and in the process, they had discovered something important about themselves and about the power of community. As the evening wore on, the storm outside continued to rage, but inside the church, there was warmth and light and a sense of peace. The refugees from the storm shared their stories, their fears, their hopes. Children played together, their laughter echoing off the high ceilings. Volunteers moved among them, offering food and comfort and reassurance. Father Michael gathered everyone together and led them in a prayer, thanking God for their safety, asking for strength and courage to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Even those who were not particularly religious found comfort in the ritual and the sense of community and shared purpose. That night, they slept on cots in the church hall, surrounded by strangers who no longer felt like strangers. The five of them, Margaret and Elena and Sophia and Marcus and James and Patricia, stayed close together, their little group within the larger group, bound by the experience they had shared. The next morning, Christmas Eve, they woke to find that the storm had finally passed. The wind had died down, the snow had stopped falling, and weak sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting colored patterns on the floor. The world outside was buried under several feet of snow, but the sky was clear, and there was a sense of hope in the air. Father Michael announced that the power was slowly being restored throughout the city, that emergency crews were working around the clock to clear the roads and help those in need. It would take time, he said, but they would get through this together. Throughout the day, people began to leave the church, making their way back to their homes or to the homes of family and friends. But Margaret and Elena and Sophia and Marcus and James and Patricia stayed, helping the volunteers clean up, prepare meals, comfort those who were still waiting for news of loved ones. They had become a team, a family of sorts, and none of them were in a hurry to break that bond. As the afternoon wore on, Father Michael approached them with a smile. "I have some good news," he said. "The power is back on in your neighborhood. You should be able to go home now if you want." They looked at each other, and there was a moment of hesitation, a reluctance to return to their separate lives, to the isolation they had known before the storm. But they also knew they could not stay in the church forever. They had homes to return to, lives to resume. "But this does not have to be the end," Patricia said suddenly. "We can stay in touch. We can be there for each other. We do not have to go back to being strangers." Everyone nodded, and there was a sense of relief, of gratitude, that this connection they had forged would not be lost. They exchanged phone numbers, made plans to have dinner together once things returned to normal, promised to check in on each other regularly. They bundled up again, though the journey back would be much easier now that the storm had passed, and made their way out of the church. The streets were still buried in snow, but the sun was shining, and the world looked clean and new, transformed by the storm into something beautiful. They walked together, helping each other over the drifts, laughing at the absurdity of it all, marveling at the fact that they had survived. When they reached their building, they stood outside for a moment, looking up at the old brick facade, seeing it with new eyes. This was more than just a building now. It was a place where people cared about each other, where neighbors looked out for one another, where community mattered. They climbed the stairs together, and when they reached the second floor, Patricia turned to the group. "Listen," she said, "tomorrow is Christmas. And I do not know about you, but I do not want to spend it alone. Why do not we all have Christmas dinner together? In our apartment. We can pool our resources, cook something special, make it a real celebration." The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Margaret's face lit up with a smile that took years off her appearance. "I would love that," she said. "I cannot remember the last time I had a real Christmas dinner with people I care about." Elena nodded, her eyes shining. "Sophia and I would be honored to join you. And I can bring some of my mother's recipes, some traditional dishes from my culture." Marcus grinned. "I am not much of a cook, but I can contribute. And I would really like to spend Christmas with you all. You have become like family to me." James put his arm around Patricia and smiled. "Then it is settled. Christmas dinner, tomorrow, our place. Everyone is invited." They said their goodbyes and went to their respective apartments, and for the first time in a long time, each of them felt a sense of anticipation, of joy, of belonging. The storm had taken so much, had been frightening and dangerous and difficult, but it had also given them something precious: connection, community, friendship. Margaret entered her apartment and looked around at the familiar space, but it felt different now, less lonely, less empty. She knew that just 2 floors below, there were people who cared about her, people who would check on her, people who would not let her be forgotten. She sat down in her armchair and picked up the phone, dialing her daughter's number. When Susan answered, Margaret could hear the worry in her voice. "Mom, are you okay? We have been so worried. The news said the storm was terrible there." "I am fine, sweetheart," Margaret said, and she realized it was true. "I am more than fine. I have something wonderful to tell you." She told Susan about the storm, about the power outage, about James and Patricia and Elena and Sophia and Marcus, about the journey to the church, about the Christmas dinner they were planning. And as she spoke, she heard the relief and happiness in her daughter's voice, and she felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the restored heat in her apartment. Elena tucked Sophia into bed that night, and her daughter looked up at her with sleepy eyes. "Mama," Sophia said, "I like our new friends. Can we see them again after Christmas?" Elena smiled and kissed her daughter's forehead. "Yes, Mija," she said. "We can see them as much as we want. They are our family now." Sophia smiled and closed her eyes, and Elena sat beside her for a long time, watching her sleep, feeling a sense of peace and gratitude that she had not felt in years. She had been so focused on survival, on making ends meet, that she had forgotten about the importance of connection, of community. But the storm had reminded her, had shown her that she did not have to do everything alone, that there were people who would help, who would care, if she was willing to let them in. Marcus sat in his apartment, looking around at the sterile space, and made a decision. Tomorrow, he would start making this place feel like home. He would buy some decorations, some plants, some personal touches. He would invite people over, would host dinners, would build a life here instead of just existing. The storm had shown him that connection was possible, that he did not have to be alone, and he was not going to waste that lesson. He picked up his phone and called his mother. When she answered, he could hear the relief in her voice, the love, and he felt a lump form in his throat. "Hey, Mom," he said. "I just wanted to tell you that I am okay. More than okay, actually. I have met some amazing people, and I am going to spend Christmas with them. And I promise I will come visit soon. I miss you all so much." His mother's voice was warm and full of emotion. "We miss you too, baby. But I am so glad you have found people there. That is all I ever wanted for you, to not be alone." James and Patricia lay in bed that night, the room dark and quiet, and for the first time in months, they were holding hands. The storm had forced them to work together, to remember why they had fallen in love in the first place, to rediscover the partnership that had been buried under years of routine and resentment. "I am sorry," James said quietly. "For checking out, for not being present, for letting us drift apart." Patricia squeezed his hand. "I am sorry too. I let my disappointment and frustration build up instead of talking to you about it. But I think we can fix this. I think we can find our way back to each other." James turned to look at her, and even in the darkness, he could see the hope in her eyes. "I think so too," he said. "And I think those people, our neighbors, they reminded us of what is important. Community, connection, caring about others. We lost sight of that, but we can get it back." Patricia nodded. "Tomorrow is going to be a good day," she said. "A really good day." Christmas Day dawned bright and clear, the sun reflecting off the snow with a brilliance that was almost blinding. The city was slowly coming back to life, the sound of snowplows and shovels filling the air, people emerging from their homes to assess the damage and begin the work of recovery. But in the apartment building on Elm Street, there was a sense of excitement, of anticipation, of joy. Margaret woke early and spent the morning baking cookies, using her mother's old recipe, the one she had not made in years. The smell of vanilla and cinnamon filled her apartment, and she hummed to herself as she worked, feeling more alive than she had in a long time. She carefully packed the cookies in a tin and made her way downstairs, her steps lighter, her heart fuller. Elena and Sophia spent the morning preparing tamales, a tradition from Elena's childhood, and Sophia helped by pressing the masa into the corn husks, her small hands working carefully, her face serious with concentration. Elena told her stories about her own mother, about the Christmases they had celebrated when Elena was young, and Sophia listened with wide eyes, soaking up the history, the culture, the love. Marcus went to the corner store, which had managed to open despite the storm, and bought a bottle of wine and some flowers. He was not sure what the protocol was for a Christmas dinner with your neighbors, but he wanted to contribute, wanted to show his appreciation for being included. James and Patricia worked together in their kitchen, preparing a turkey and all the trimmings, moving around each other with an ease and familiarity that had been missing for so long. They talked and laughed, and Patricia caught herself thinking that this felt like the early days of their marriage, when everything had been new and exciting and full of possibility. Maybe, she thought, they could recapture that feeling, could build something new on the foundation of what they had once had. By early afternoon, they began to gather in the Kowalskis' apartment. Margaret arrived first, carrying her tin of cookies, and Patricia hugged her warmly, taking the tin and exclaiming over the delicious smell. Elena and Sophia came next, Sophia wearing a red dress that Elena had stayed up late the night before to iron, her hair in pigtails, her face glowing with excitement. Marcus arrived last, presenting the wine and flowers with a shy smile, and James clapped him on the back and welcomed him in. The apartment had been transformed. Patricia had dug out all their Christmas decorations, things they had not bothered to put up in years, and the space was festive and warm, with lights twinkling and garland draped over the doorways. The table was set with their best dishes, mismatched but charming, and the smell of roasting turkey and baking bread filled the air. They gathered around the table, this unlikely family, and James raised his glass. "I want to make a toast," he said. "To the storm that brought us together. To the kindness of strangers who became friends. To the reminder that we are not alone, that we have each other, and that community and connection are the most important things in life. Merry Christmas to all of you." "Merry Christmas," they echoed, clinking glasses, and the sound was joyful and bright. They ate and talked and laughed, the conversation flowing easily, the food delicious, the atmosphere warm and loving. Sophia sat between Margaret and Elena, and the old woman told her stories, making her giggle, and Elena watched with tears in her eyes, grateful beyond words for this gift, this sense of belonging. Marcus found himself talking to James about sports, about work, about life, and he realized that he had not had a real conversation like this in months, maybe years. He had been so isolated, so focused on his career, that he had forgotten the simple pleasure of human connection. Patricia looked around the table at the faces of these people who had come into her life so unexpectedly, and she felt a profound sense of gratitude. The storm had been terrifying, had been dangerous, but it had also been a gift, a wake-up call, a reminder of what truly mattered. She reached over and took James's hand, and he squeezed it, and they shared a smile that spoke of understanding, of forgiveness, of hope. After dinner, they moved to the living room, and Sophia insisted that they sing Christmas carols. They sang off-key and with great enthusiasm, and the sound filled the apartment and spilled out into the hallway, and other residents of the building, hearing the joy, found themselves smiling, found themselves feeling a little less alone. As the evening wore on, Sophia began to yawn, and Elena knew it was time to go. They said their goodbyes, with hugs and promises to see each other soon, and as Elena carried her sleepy daughter back to their apartment, she felt a sense of peace and contentment that she had not felt in years. Margaret lingered a bit longer, not wanting the evening to end, and Patricia sat beside her on the couch, holding her hand. "Thank you," Margaret said softly. "For everything. For including me, for making me feel like I matter." Patricia's eyes filled with tears. "You do matter," she said. "You matter so much. And we are going to make sure you never feel alone again." Margaret nodded, unable to speak, and they sat together in comfortable silence, two women from different generations, bound by the simple act of kindness, by the choice to reach out, to connect, to care. Marcus was the last to leave, and as he stood at the door, he turned to James and Patricia. "I just want to say thank you," he said, "for checking on me during the storm, for including me in all of this. I was feeling really lost, really alone, and you guys reminded me that there are good people in the world, that connection is possible. You changed my life." James shook his hand firmly. "You changed ours too," he said. "All of you did. We were stuck, Patricia and I, stuck in our own problems, our own disappointments. But helping you all, being part of this community, it reminded us of who we used to be, who we want to be. So thank you." Marcus nodded, his throat tight with emotion, and then he left, making his way down to his apartment, feeling lighter than he had in months. James closed the door and turned to Patricia, and they looked at each other for a long moment. "We did good," he said. Patricia smiled. "We did really good." They cleaned up together, working in companionable silence, and when they finally went to bed, they fell asleep holding each other, feeling hopeful about the future for the first time in a long time. The days after Christmas were busy ones. The city worked to recover from the storm, clearing the streets, restoring power to the last few neighborhoods that were still without it, helping those who had lost homes or been injured. But in the apartment building on Elm Street, something new was growing, something that had been planted during the storm and was now taking root. Margaret started a weekly coffee hour in her apartment, inviting anyone in the building who wanted to come. At first, it was just the 5 of them, but slowly, others began to join, curious about this group of neighbors who seemed to genuinely care about each other. The coffee hours became a fixture, a time to catch up, to share news, to offer help and support. Elena, with encouragement from the others, enrolled in a community college program to get her degree. Margaret offered to babysit Sophia whenever Elena had classes or needed to study, and the two of them formed a bond that was deep and genuine, a grandmother and granddaughter relationship that filled a void in both their lives. Marcus started a game night, hosting it in his apartment every other week, and it became a popular event, with people bringing snacks and drinks and staying late into the night, playing board games and card games and just enjoying each other's company. He also started dating again, putting himself out there, and while it was scary, he felt ready, felt like he had a support system now, people who would be there for him no matter what. James and Patricia started volunteering at the church, helping Father Michael with his outreach programs, serving meals to the homeless, organizing donation drives. They worked side by side, rediscovering their partnership, rebuilding their marriage one act of service at a time. They also started a building-wide initiative to check on elderly residents, to make sure no one was isolated or forgotten, and it became a model for other buildings in the neighborhood. The building on Elm Street became known as a place where people cared about each other, where neighbors were more than just people who lived in proximity, where community was real and tangible. Other buildings started to take notice, started to implement similar programs, and slowly, the whole neighborhood began to change, to become more connected, more compassionate. Years later, when people talked about the great snowstorm, they would remember the cold and the fear and the danger. But they would also remember the kindness, the connection, the way strangers became family, the way a crisis brought out the best in people. They would remember Margaret and Elena and Sophia and Marcus and James and Patricia, and the way they had chosen to reach out, to care, to build something beautiful out of something terrifying. And on every Christmas after that first one, they would gather together, this chosen family, and they would share a meal and tell stories and remember the storm that had changed their lives. Sophia would grow up knowing that family was not just about blood, but about love and commitment and showing up for each other. Margaret would spend her final years surrounded by people who loved her, never alone, never forgotten. Elena would get her degree and a better job, and she would always credit her success to the support of her community. Marcus would eventually meet someone special, would get married, would have children, and he would raise them in that building, teaching them the importance of community and connection. And James and Patricia would grow old together, their love renewed and strengthened, their lives enriched by the people they had chosen to let in. The snowstorm had been a trial, a test, a challenge that had pushed them to their limits. But it had also been a gift, a reminder that even in the darkest, coldest moments, there is warmth to be found in human connection, in the simple act of reaching out to another person and saying, "I see you. I care about you. You are not alone." And that, in the end, was the true magic of Christmas, the true meaning of the season. Not the presents or the decorations or the elaborate meals, but the love, the compassion, the willingness to open your heart and your home to others, to build community, to create family where there was none before. The wind still howled through the streets of Maplewood on cold winter nights, and the snow still fell, blanketing the town in white. But in the apartment building on Elm Street, there was always warmth, always light, always the sound of laughter and conversation and life. Because 5 people had made a choice, had decided that isolation and loneliness were not inevitable, that connection was possible, that community could be built, one act of kindness at a time. And that choice, made in the midst of a storm, had rippled outward, touching lives, changing hearts, transforming a building, a neighborhood, a city. It had shown that even the smallest acts of compassion could have profound effects, that one person reaching out to another could start a chain reaction of goodness that would spread far beyond what anyone could imagine. Margaret would often sit by her window in the years that followed, looking out at the street below, watching the seasons change, watching the neighborhood evolve. And she would think about that Christmas, about the storm that had brought them all together, about the fear and the cold and the desperate journey through the snow. But mostly, she would think about the warmth, the love, the sense of belonging that had come from it. She would think about Sophia's laughter, about Elena's strength, about Marcus's kindness, about James and Patricia's renewed love. And she would smile, grateful beyond words for the gift she had been given, the gift of family, of community, of connection. On one particular evening, many years after that first Christmas together, the group gathered once again in what had become the traditional spot, the Kowalskis' apartment, though it had been renovated and updated over the years. Sophia was now a teenager, tall and confident, with her mother's dark eyes and her grandmother Margaret's gentle wisdom. She helped set the table, moving with the easy grace of someone who had grown up in this space, surrounded by love. Elena, now in her 40s, had finished her degree and was working as a teacher, a job she loved, a job that allowed her to give back to her community in meaningful ways. She stood in the kitchen with Patricia, the two of them working side by side as they had done countless times before, their friendship deep and unshakable. Marcus, now married with 2 young children of his own, sat on the floor playing with his kids, building towers out of blocks and making them laugh with silly voices. His wife, a woman he had met at one of the building's community events, sat beside him, watching with a smile, grateful for the community that had welcomed her so warmly when she had joined this family. James and Patricia, now in their 60s, moved around the apartment with the ease of people who had spent decades together, who had weathered storms both literal and metaphorical, who had chosen each other again and again, every single day. Their hair was grayer, their movements a bit slower, but their love was stronger than ever, tempered by time and trial and triumph. And Margaret, now in her 80s, sat in the place of honor at the head of the table, her face lined with age but her eyes still bright and sharp. She looked around at the faces of the people she loved, at the family she had found in the midst of a storm, and she felt a profound sense of peace, of completion, of joy. As they sat down to eat, James raised his glass, as he did every year, and made his toast. "To the storm that brought us together," he said, his voice strong and clear. "To the family we have built. To the love that sustains us. To the community that makes life worth living. Merry Christmas to all of you." "Merry Christmas," they echoed, and the sound filled the apartment, filled the building, filled the neighborhood, a testament to the power of human connection, to the magic that happens when people choose to care for each other, to reach out across the divides of age and background and circumstance and say, "You are not alone. I am here. We are family." Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and gentle this time, covering the streets in a fresh blanket of white. But inside, there was warmth and light and laughter, and the knowledge that no matter what storms might come, they would face them together, as they always had, as they always would. The meal was delicious, a combination of traditional dishes and new recipes that had been added over the years, each one representing a different member of their extended family, each one a story, a memory, a piece of their shared history. They ate slowly, savoring not just the food but the company, the conversation, the sense of belonging that permeated every moment. After dinner, they moved to the living room, and Sophia, now old enough to understand the significance of the tradition, asked Margaret to tell the story. "Tell us about the storm, Grandma Margaret," she said, using the title that had been bestowed upon the old woman years ago, a title that Margaret wore with pride and love. Margaret smiled and settled back in her chair, and everyone gathered around, even the little ones, sensing that something important was about to happen. "It was a long time ago," Margaret began, her voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller, a keeper of history. "The winter of 2025. The snow had been falling for days, and the wind was howling like a living thing, and the cold was so bitter it seemed to seep into your very bones." She told the story as she had told it many times before, but it never got old, never lost its power. She told them about the loneliness she had felt, about the fear when the power went out, about the moment when James and Patricia had knocked on her door and offered her kindness. She told them about the journey through the storm, about the way they had tied themselves together with rope, about the relief when they had finally reached the church. She told them about that first Christmas dinner, about the way strangers had become family, about the choice they had all made to stay connected, to build something lasting. As she spoke, the others added their own memories, their own perspectives. Elena talked about how scared she had been, how worried about Sophia, how grateful she had been for the support. Marcus talked about how lost he had felt, how the storm had forced him to confront his isolation, how finding this community had changed the trajectory of his life. James and Patricia talked about how the storm had saved their marriage, had reminded them of what was truly important, had given them a purpose beyond themselves. And Sophia listened, her eyes wide, absorbing every word, understanding in a way she had not been able to when she was younger just how precious this family was, how rare, how worth protecting and nurturing. She looked around at the faces of the people who had raised her, who had loved her, who had shown her what it meant to be part of a community, and she felt a fierce determination to carry on this legacy, to pass it on to her own children someday, to make sure that the lessons of the storm were never forgotten. When the story was finished, there was a moment of silence, a moment of reflection, and then Marcus's youngest child, a little boy of 3, piped up. "Can we have hot chocolate now?" Everyone laughed, the spell broken, and Patricia got up to make hot chocolate for everyone, and they spent the rest of the evening playing games and singing carols and simply being together. This family that had been forged in a storm and had grown stronger with each passing year. As the evening drew to a close and people began to gather their things to leave, Margaret pulled Sophia aside. She took the young woman's hands in her own, feeling the strength in them, the warmth, the life. "You are going to do great things," she said softly. "You are going to make a difference in this world. But never forget where you came from, never forget the importance of community, of connection, of caring for others. That is the real legacy of the storm, the real gift we were given." Sophia nodded, tears in her eyes. "I will never forget, Grandma Margaret. I promise." Margaret pulled her into a hug, holding her close, and whispered, "I love you, Mija. You are the best thing that ever happened to all of us." When everyone had finally left and the apartment was quiet again, James and Patricia stood at the window, looking out at the snow-covered street, at the lights twinkling in the windows of the other apartments, at the world that had been transformed by a storm so many years ago. Do you ever think about what would have happened if we had not knocked on those doors that night? Patricia asked quietly. James put his arm around her and pulled her close. All the time, he said. And I am so grateful that we did. That storm was the best thing that ever happened to us. Patricia nodded, leaning her head on his shoulder. It gave us back our lives, she said. It gave us back each other. It gave us a family. They stood there for a long time, watching the snow fall, feeling the warmth of their home, the love that filled it, the sense of purpose and meaning that had come from a simple choice to reach out, to care, to connect. And they knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that they had been part of something special, something rare, something that would endure long after they were gone. The years continued to pass, as years do, bringing with them changes and challenges and joys. Margaret eventually passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 87, surrounded by the family she had found, her hand held by Elena on one side and Patricia on the other. Her funeral was held at St. Mary's Church, and it was standing room only, filled with people whose lives she had touched, whose hearts she had opened, whose loneliness she had eased. Father Michael, now quite elderly himself, spoke about her kindness, her wisdom, her unwavering commitment to community. And when they laid her to rest, they planted a tree in her honor in the small park across from the apartment building, a tree that would grow tall and strong, providing shade and beauty for generations to come, a living memorial to a woman who had shown them all what it meant to truly live. Elena continued to teach, inspiring countless students with her passion and dedication, and she never forgot the lessons she had learned during the storm, the importance of asking for help, of accepting kindness, of building community. She eventually became a principal, and she made sure that her school was a place where every child felt seen, valued, and supported, where no one was left behind, where community was not just a word but a lived reality. Marcus rose through the ranks at his company, eventually becoming a vice president, but he never lost sight of what was truly important. He made sure to prioritize his family, his community, his relationships, and he became known as a leader who cared about people, who valued connection over profit, who understood that success was meaningless without love and belonging. He also started a foundation that provided support for people who were isolated or lonely, offering programs and resources to help them build community, to find connection, to know that they were not alone. James and Patricia grew old together, their love a beacon for everyone who knew them, a testament to the power of commitment, of forgiveness, of choosing each other every single day. They continued to volunteer, to serve, to give back, and they became beloved figures in the neighborhood, the couple who had started it all, who had knocked on doors during a storm and changed countless lives in the process. And Sophia, the little girl who had been so frightened during the storm, grew into a remarkable young woman. She went to college and studied social work, driven by a desire to help others, to build community, to carry on the legacy of the family that had raised her. She returned to Maplewood after graduation and started a nonprofit organization that focused on combating isolation and loneliness, particularly among the elderly. She called it the Snowstorm Project, in honor of the event that had brought her family together, and it grew rapidly, expanding to other cities, touching thousands of lives, proving that the lessons of that Christmas so many years ago were universal, timeless, desperately needed. On the 10th anniversary of Margaret's passing, Sophia organized a special event in the park where the memorial tree had been planted. It was a cold December day, much like the day of the storm, and snow was falling gently, covering the ground in a soft white blanket. People gathered from all over the city, people whose lives had been touched by Margaret, by the Kowalskis, by Elena, by Marcus, by the community that had been built in the wake of a crisis. Sophia stood beneath the tree, now tall and strong, its branches reaching toward the sky, and she spoke to the assembled crowd. She told the story of the storm, of the 5 people who had come together, of the choice they had made to reach out, to care, to build something lasting. She talked about the ripple effects of that choice, about how it had spread outward, touching lives, changing hearts, transforming communities. And she challenged everyone there to make the same choice, to reach out to someone who was lonely, to build community where there was none, to be the change they wanted to see in the world. As she spoke, the snow continued to fall, and the crowd listened in silence, moved by her words, inspired by her passion, reminded of the power they each held to make a difference. And when she finished, they did not applaud, but instead, they turned to the people standing next to them, strangers and friends alike, and they introduced themselves, they shook hands, they hugged, they began to build connections, to create community, right there in that moment, beneath the tree that stood as a testament to the power of love and kindness and human connection. Elena stood at the edge of the crowd, tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by pride and gratitude. This was her daughter, this remarkable young woman who had taken the lessons of her childhood and turned them into something that would outlive them all, something that would continue to spread light and love and connection long after they were gone. She felt Margaret's presence in that moment, felt the old woman's spirit in the falling snow, in the rustling of the tree's branches, in the warmth of the community that had gathered. And she whispered, "Thank you, Grandma Margaret. Thank you for everything." Marcus stood with his wife and children, watching Sophia speak, and he thought about the young man he had been all those years ago, lost and alone and desperate for connection. He thought about how close he had come to spending his life in isolation, how easily he could have missed out on all of this, on the love and the family and the sense of purpose that had come from that one Christmas during a storm. And he made a silent vow to never take it for granted, to always remember how precious it was, to always choose connection over isolation, love over fear, community over loneliness. James and Patricia, now quite elderly, sat on a bench near the tree, wrapped in blankets, holding hands as they always did. They watched the crowd, watched Sophia, watched the snowfall, and they felt a profound sense of peace, of completion, of a life well lived. They had made mistakes, had struggled, had nearly lost each other, but they had also made the choice to reach out, to care, to build something beautiful. And that choice had defined the rest of their lives, had given them purpose and meaning and joy beyond measure. As the event drew to a close and people began to disperse, many of them lingered, reluctant to leave, reluctant to break the spell of connection and community that had been woven in that place. They exchanged phone numbers, made plans to meet for coffee, invited each other to holiday gatherings. And as they walked away, they carried with them the message of the storm, the lesson that had been learned all those years ago, that we are not meant to be alone. That connection is not just nice to have but essential to our survival and our humanity, that community can be built, one act of kindness at a time. That evening, as had become tradition, the family gathered once more in what was now Sophia's apartment in the same building on Elm Street. She had moved into Margaret's old apartment after the old woman had passed, wanting to keep the space in the family, wanting to honor her memory by continuing to use it as a place of gathering and love. The apartment had been updated over the years, but it still held echoes of Margaret, her books still on the shelves, her ceramic bird still displayed with pride, her spirit still present in every corner. They sat around the table, this family that had been forged in a storm and had endured through decades, and they shared a meal and told stories and laughed and cried and remembered. They talked about Margaret, about her wisdom and her kindness and her unwavering belief in the power of community. They talked about the storm, about how it had changed their lives, about the lessons they had learned and the legacy they were building. And as the evening wore on and the snow continued to fall outside, covering the city in a blanket of white, they felt the presence of all those who had come before, all those who had been part of this journey, all those who had contributed to the building of this remarkable family. They felt Margaret's gentle wisdom. They felt the love of all the neighbors who had joined their coffee hours and game nights and holiday gatherings over the years. They felt the support of the entire community that had grown up around them. Sophia looked around the table at the faces of the people she loved, at Elena, still strong and vibrant in her 60s, at Marcus and his family, at James and Patricia, now in their 80s but still holding hands, still choosing each other, still showing everyone what love looked like. And she felt a profound sense of gratitude, of responsibility, of determination to carry on this legacy, to make sure that the lessons of the storm were never forgotten, that the power of community and connection continued to spread, to touch lives, to change the world. As they prepared to leave that night, Elena pulled Sophia aside, much as Margaret had done so many years before. She took her daughter's hands and looked into her eyes, seeing the strength there, the compassion, the determination. "You have done something remarkable, Mija," she said softly. "You have taken what we learned during the storm and turned it into something that will outlive all of us. Grandma Margaret would be so proud of you. I am so proud of you." Sophia felt tears prick at her eyes. "I could not have done it without all of you," she said. "Without the example you set, without the love you showed me, without the community you built. This is not my legacy, Mama. It is ours. It belongs to all of us." Elena pulled her into a hug, holding her close, and whispered, "That is exactly right. It belongs to all of us. And it will continue, long after we are gone, because we chose to reach out, to care, to build something that matters." When everyone had finally left and Sophia was alone in the apartment, she walked to the window and looked out at the snow-covered street, at the lights twinkling in the windows of the other apartments, at the tree in the park across the way, standing tall and strong, a living memorial to the woman who had started it all. She thought about the storm, about the fear and the cold and the desperate journey through the snow. But mostly, she thought about the warmth, the love, the sense of belonging that had come from it. She thought about the choice that 5 people had made all those years ago, the choice to reach out, to care, to build community. And she thought about how that choice had rippled outward, touching countless lives, changing hearts, transforming neighborhoods and cities and maybe, just maybe, the world. And she made a promise, to herself, to Margaret, to her family, to everyone who had been part of this journey. She promised to continue the work, to keep building community, to keep spreading the message of the storm, to make sure that no one had to face the cold and the darkness alone. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and gentle, covering the world in white, transforming the familiar into something magical and new. And inside the apartment on the 3rd floor of the old brick building on Elm Street, Sophia stood at the window, watching the snow, feeling the warmth of her home, the love that filled it, the sense of purpose and meaning that had been passed down to her like a precious inheritance. She thought about all the people out there in the city, in the world, who were alone, who were cold, who were frightened, who were longing for connection. And she thought about how many of them could be reached, could be helped, could be brought into community if only someone would reach out, would knock on their door, would offer them kindness and warmth and belonging. The storm had taught them that crisis could be an opportunity, that hardship could bring out the best in people, that connection was not just possible but essential. It had taught them that family was not just about blood but about choice, about commitment, about showing up for each other day after day, year after year. It had taught them that community could be built, that isolation could be overcome, that love was stronger than fear, that warmth was more powerful than cold. And those lessons, learned in the midst of a snowstorm so many years ago, had become the foundation of a movement, a way of life, a legacy that would endure for generations to come. Because 5 people had made a choice, had decided that they would not face the storm alone, that they would reach out to each other, that they would build something lasting and beautiful and true. The snowstorm that had brought together neighbors and strangers had become more than just a memory, more than just a story told around the dinner table on Christmas. It had become a symbol, a reminder, a call to action. It had become a testament to the power of human connection, to the magic that happens when people choose to care for each other, to the transformation that is possible when we open our hearts and our homes and our lives to others. And so the story continues, passed down from generation to generation, a story of fear and courage, of isolation and connection, of cold and warmth, of strangers becoming family. It is a story that reminds us that we are not alone, that we have each other, that community is not something that happens to us, but something we create, one choice at a time, one act of kindness at a time, one open door at a time. The snow falls, as it always does in winter, covering the world in white, transforming the landscape, creating beauty and danger in equal measure. But inside the homes and apartments and buildings where people have chosen to reach out, to care, to build community, there is warmth and light and love. There is the sound of laughter and conversation and life. There is the knowledge that no matter what storms may come, they will be faced together, as family, as community, as people who have chosen each other and will continue to choose each other, day after day, year after year, for as long as they live. And that, in the end, is the true gift of the snowstorm, the true magic of Christmas, the true meaning of it all. Not the presents or the decorations or the elaborate meals, but the love, the connection, the sense of belonging that comes from opening your heart to another person and saying, I see you, I care about you, you are not alone. We are family. We are community. We are home. The wind howls, the snow falls, the world turns cold and dark. But inside, there is always warmth, always light, always the promise that spring will come again, that the sun will shine, that life will continue. And in the meantime, we have each other, and that is enough, more than enough, everything we need to not just survive but to thrive, to flourish, to live lives of meaning and purpose and joy. The story of the snowstorm that brought together neighbors and strangers is a story that belongs to all of us, a story that reminds us of our shared humanity, of our deep need for connection, of our capacity for kindness and compassion and love. It is a story that challenges us to look beyond our own fears and insecurities, to reach out to those around us, to build bridges instead of walls, to create community instead of isolation. It is a story that asks us to remember that every person we pass on the street, every neighbor we have never spoken to, every stranger we encounter, is someone with their own story, their own struggles, their own longing for connection and belonging. It is a story that reminds us that a simple act of kindness, a knock on a door, an offer of help, can change a life, can start a ripple effect that spreads far beyond what we can imagine. And it is a story that gives us hope, that shows us that even in the darkest, coldest moments, even when we feel most alone and most afraid, there is always the possibility of warmth, of light, of connection. There is always the possibility that someone will reach out, that someone will care, that someone will remind us that we are not alone, that we are part of something larger than ourselves, that we are loved and valued and needed. The snowstorm came and went, as storms do, leaving behind a transformed landscape, a changed world. But the real transformation was not in the physical world, not in the piles of snow or the downed power lines or the closed roads. The real transformation was in the hearts of the people who lived through it, who chose to reach out to each other, who built something lasting and beautiful and true. And that transformation continues to this day, spreading outward in ever-widening circles, touching lives, changing hearts, building community. It continues in the coffee hours and game nights and holiday gatherings, and the volunteers who serve meals and check on elderly neighbors, and the organizations that combat isolation and loneliness, and the countless small acts of kindness that happen every day, often unseen and unacknowledged but no less powerful for their quiet nature. It continues in the stories that are told, in the memories that are shared, and the lessons that are passed down from one generation to the next. It continues in the tree that stands in the park, growing taller and stronger with each passing year, its roots deep in the earth, its branches reaching toward the sky, a living symbol of the power of love and connection and community. And it continues in the hearts of all those who have been touched by the story, who have been inspired by the example of 5 people who made a choice during a storm, who have decided to make the same choice in their own lives, to reach out, to care, to build community wherever they are, whatever their circumstances. The snowstorm that brought together neighbors and strangers was a moment in time, a crisis that lasted only a few days. But its impact has lasted decades, has touched thousands of lives, has changed the trajectory of a neighborhood, a city, a movement. And it all started with a simple choice, a decision to knock on a door, to check on a neighbor, to offer help to someone in need. That is the power we all hold, the power to change lives, to build community, to create connection. It does not require wealth or status or special skills. It only requires a willingness to see the people around us, to recognize their humanity, to reach out with kindness and compassion and love. It only requires us to remember that we are all in this together, that we all need each other, that we are all part of the same human family. The snow falls, covering the world in white, and inside the apartment on the 3rd floor of the old brick building on Elm Street, Sophia turns away from the window and looks around at the space that has been home to so much love, so much laughter, so much life. She sees Margaret's books on the shelves, her ceramic birds on display, her spirit present in every corner. She feels the warmth of the apartment, the love that fills it, the sense of purpose and meaning that has been passed down to her. And she makes a decision, a choice that echoes the choice made by James and Patricia all those years ago. She decides that she will not let this legacy die, that she will continue to build community, to spread the message of the storm, to make sure that no one has to face the cold and the darkness alone. She decides that she will live her life in a way that honors Margaret, that honors her mother, that honors all those who have been part of this journey. She decides that she will be a light in the darkness, a source of warmth in the cold, a reminder that we are not alone, that we have each other, that love is stronger than fear. And with that decision, the story continues, as it always has, as it always will, for as long as there are people willing to reach out, to care, to build community. The snowstorm that brought together neighbors and strangers was not an ending but a beginning, the start of something that will endure for generations, that will continue to spread light and love and connection throughout the world. The wind howls, the snow falls, the world turns cold and dark. But inside, there is warmth, there is light, there is love. And that is enough. That is everything. That is the true magic of Christmas, the true gift of the storm, the true meaning of it all. We are not alone. We have each other. We are family. We are community. We are home. And so the story ends where it began, with the snow falling on a small town, with people huddled in their homes, with the cold pressing in from all sides. But now, there is a difference. Now, there is connection. Now, there is community. Now, there is the knowledge that no matter what storms may come, they will be faced together, as family, as neighbors, as people who have chosen each other and will continue to choose each other, day after day, year after year, for as long as they live. The snowstorm brought them together, but it was their choice to stay together, to build something lasting, to create a family out of strangers that made all the difference. It was their willingness to be vulnerable, to ask for help, to offer help, to open their hearts and their homes and their lives to each other that transformed a crisis into an opportunity, a tragedy into a triumph, isolation into connection. And that is the lesson, the gift, the legacy of the snowstorm. That we have the power to change our lives, to change the lives of others, to change the world, one choice at a time, one act of kindness at a time, one open door at a time. That we are not powerless in the face of loneliness and isolation and fear, but that we have within us the capacity to create warmth and light and love, to build community, to forge connections that will sustain us through whatever storms may come. The story of the snowstorm that brought together neighbors and strangers is a story of hope, of courage, of love. It is a story that reminds us of what is possible when we choose to reach out, to care, to build something beautiful and lasting and true. It is a story that belongs to all of us, that calls to all of us, that challenges us to make the same choice, to take the same risk, to open our hearts and our homes and our lives to the people around us. And it is a story that will continue, as long as there are people willing to listen, willing to learn, willing to act. It will continue in the hearts of all those who have been touched by it, who have been inspired by it, who have decided to carry on the legacy, to spread the message, to build community wherever they are. The snow falls, soft and gentle, covering the world in white. And inside the homes and apartments and buildings where people have chosen to reach out, to care, to build community, there is warmth and light and love. There is the sound of laughter and conversation and life. There is the knowledge that we are not alone, that we have each other, that we are family. And that is the true gift of Christmas, the true magic of the season, the true meaning of it all. Not the presents or the decorations or the elaborate meals, but the love, the connection, the sense of belonging that comes from opening your heart to another person and saying, I see you, I care about you, you are not alone. The snowstorm came and went, but its legacy endures. The 5 people who came together during that storm, Margaret and Elena and Sophia and Marcus and James and Patricia, are gone now, or will be soon, claimed by time and age and the natural progression of life. But what they built, what they created, what they started, that will endure. It will endure in the hearts of all those they touched, and the lives they changed, and the community they built. It will endure in Sophia's organization, the Snowstorm Project, which continues to grow and expand, reaching more and more people, combating isolation and loneliness, building community in cities and towns across the country and around the world. It will endure in the countless small acts of kindness that happen every day, inspired by their example, motivated by their story, driven by the same desire to reach out, to care, to connect. It will endure in the tree that stands in the park, a living memorial to Margaret, a symbol of the power of love and connection and community. It will endure in the apartment building on Elm Street, where neighbors still know each other, still look out for each other, still gather for coffee hours and game nights and holiday celebrations. It will endure in the stories that are told, and the memories that are shared, and the lessons that are passed down from one generation to the next. And it will endure in the hearts of all those who have heard the story, who have been moved by it, who have decided to make the same choice, to take the same risk, to reach out to the people around them, to build community, to create connection, to spread warmth and light and love in a world that so desperately needs it.